In today's episode, I'm going to tell you 3 different stories from witnesses who've gone camping in the woods and had experiences that were so terrifying they changed their lives. You won't want to miss this one. On May 15th, 1997, a 27-year-old man named Jedith Rodrigo was enjoying a quiet evening in his RV near the Everglades National Park in Florida. His German Shepherd, who had been his faithful companion for years, was laying at his feet as he watched TV. And so around 9 p.m. that night, his dog started acting strangely, pawing at the door, wanting to go outside. Now, Jedith didn't think much of it. His dog was well trained and normally just needed a quick bathroom break before bed. And so he opened the RV door and let his shepherd out into the darkness. But then, just moments later, he heard a single yelp from his dog. Now, the man had owned this shepherd for years, and he had never heard his dog make a sound like that before. And so he grabbed his flashlight and he headed outside to check on his pet. And as he stepped out of his RV, he kind of just flooded the area with the light, sweeping the beam back and forth across the ground. Now, at first, he didn't see anything unusual, but then his light caught something that made him freeze in place. Because standing there, not 20 feet away, was some kind of creature. It was almost yellow in color, about 3 feet tall, and the man estimated it weighed around 100 pounds. The thing that really caught his attention, though, were its eyes. They were kind of glowing green, and strangest of all, they continued glowing even when the flashlight beam hit them directly. And so Jedith stood there trembling, holding onto the flashlight as he took in more details of this thing. It also had 5 distinct spines running down its back, each one about 2.5 feet long. But he saw something at its feet. It was his German Shepherd, and the creature was actively feeding on him. His dog was a 120-pound shepherd who had once fought off 2 coyotes that had gotten into their backyard in Tampa, and now its body lay completely lifeless on the ground. But despite his terror, he just started screaming, "Hey, get away from him!" But when the thing's head snapped up, it let out this screeching sound, and it was so horrible, it almost sounded mechanical, like metal grinding against metal. And then in one fluid motion, it turned and ran off into the darkness on 2 legs, moving faster than any person Jedith had ever seen. So he rushed over to his dog, his flashlight beam is kind of just shaking as he approached, and what he saw made him physically sick. His dog's neck was completely twisted backward, and there were 2 distinct fang marks in its throat. The really strange thing was, when Jedith put his hand on his dog's body, it felt hollow. It was like everything inside had been drained out. And then just as Jedith was trying to process what was happening, he heard another screech in the distance. It was the same horrible sound, but this time, it seemed to be answered by another one from a different direction. Now he's thinking there's more of them out there, they're communicating, I need to get out of here. Now he knew he had to do something to preserve the evidence of what had happened, and so, despite being completely terrified, he scooped up his dog's body, and remember, this was a very large German Shepherd, carried him back to the RV, and the whole time he just keeps thinking, I've got to document this because nobody's going to believe me otherwise. Now, Jedith happened to work as a mortician back in Tampa, and so he knew something about preserving bodies. He managed to get his dog into the small RV bathtub, and he grabbed all the ice he had in his freezer and packed it around the body. Now at this point, he's hearing more of those strange mechanical screeching sounds outside, and they seem to be getting closer. And so Jedith just jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the RV, and just started driving. He didn't even pack up his camping gear or anything. He just left it all there. The nearest vet was in a town called Okapi, about 30 miles away. And the whole drive there, he just kept checking his rearview mirror, convinced he was going to see one of those things following him. He pulled into the vet's parking lot at around 11:45 that night, and even though the place was technically closed, they had an emergency number posted on the door. When the vet, Dr. Martinez, arrived 20 minutes later, Jedith was still sitting in his RV, too scared to get out. Now, as Dr. Martinez examined his dog's body, his face went completely white, and Jedith even noticed that the vet's hands were still as he looked at those fang marks, and the vet just stopped and stared at him for a long moment. And he says to Jedith, "Look, I need you to tell me exactly where this happened. Was it near the old canal system?" When Jedith nodded yes, the vet just walked over to the filing cabinet, pulled out a thick folder. Inside were dozens of photographs, all showing different animals with the same injuries as his dog, like cattle, even a horse, all with broken necks and the same fang marks. Now, Dr. Martinez explained to Jedith that this had been happening for months. Authorities wouldn't listen. They kept saying it's just panthers or bears, but he's been a vet in the Everglades for 22 years and has never seen any natural predator do this. Dr. Martinez closed the folder and explained that whatever this thing is, it's not stopping. He showed Jedith a map where he'd marked all the attacks, and they formed a clear pattern moving steadily north through the Everglades. The attacks were getting more frequent and closer to populated areas. He told Jedith that just last week, something had killed 3 guard dogs at a construction site near Naples. The security camera footage mysteriously disappeared, and the local PD had written it off as vandalism. But those dogs had the exact same marks. Jedith's mind was completely blown. He has no idea how this wasn't public knowledge. How are all these people out camping and hiking with no warning? Now, he asked the vet why nobody was talking about this, and the vet's response really bothered him. He explained that every time somebody reported these incidents to Fish and Wildlife or the police, strange men in unmarked vehicles would show up within hours. They'd confiscate any evidence and tell witnesses it was just a bear attack, don't talk about it. But bears don't drain their prey completely of blood, and they certainly don't leave those distinctive fang marks. The vet went on to tell Jedith about a local ranger who had tried to go public with similar findings 3 months ago. He had photos, videos, even plaster casts of bizarre footprints, but the day before his scheduled press conference, he suddenly quit his job and moved out of state. Nobody had heard from him since. Now, at this point, Jedith noticed the vet kept glancing nervously out the window into the parking lot. Dr. Martinez lowered his voice and told Jedith that he needed to leave now. And he said he'd already told him too much, but he couldn't stay quiet anymore. Too many animals were dying. And as Jedith got up to leave, the vet grabbed his arm and told him one last thing. He said there was something he hadn't shown anyone else yet. 2 days ago, he'd found something embedded in one of the fang marks on a dead cow. It looked like a metallic tooth, but it wasn't made of any material he'd ever seen before. But before he could show it to Jedith, they both heard a familiar sound coming from behind the clinic. It was that same mechanical screeching that Jedith had heard in the Everglades. He practically ran to his RV, jumped inside, locked every door and window. He pulled down all the shades, but it didn't matter. He could still hear the same screeching outside his RV all night long. Now, at some point, he must have fallen asleep because he had this vivid dream of bright lights and tall, glowing figures standing over him. But when he woke up the next morning, he couldn't remember any details, just fragments that slipped away like smoke whenever he tried to focus on them. At around 8 in the morning, there was a knock on his RV door. When he opened it, there were 3 men in black suits standing there. They didn't introduce themselves or show any badges, they just started talking. They informed him that Dr. Martinez had decided to suddenly retire last night and had already moved away to spend time with family. They told Jedith that his dog's body had been disposed of due to health concerns and handed him a document stating his dog had died from a rare viral infection. One of the men explained that signing this document would entitle him to financial compensation for his loss. The tallest of the 3 pulled out another document, a non-disclosure agreement. He told Jedith that everything that happened last night was classified information relating to national security. If he ever spoke about what he saw in the Everglades or his conversation with the vet, he would face severe legal consequences. Well, it would not be until years later where Jedith confided his story to several sources under the guise of complete anonymity. The events of that night in May of 1997 were never officially explained. The strange creatures, the vanishing vet, the mysterious men in suits, and the dozens of unexplained animal deaths throughout the Everglades, the truth behind it all is unknown. On the night of August 20th, 2011, a young man and his group of friends were headed out for what they thought would be a normal weekend of camping in Wisconsin. They had loaded up his truck with all their camping gear and were following his brother's SUV down these winding back roads towards some family property they owned out in the woods. The group consisted of the main witness, his older and younger brothers, their girlfriends, his best friend, and his older brother's best friend and girlfriend. And so, after about an hour of driving, they finally arrived at this beautiful, secluded property that had a small cabin right next to a lake. The afternoon was perfect for camping, and so they spent a couple hours hauling all their gear from the vehicles up to the cabin and getting everything set up just the way they wanted it. And then, once it was all organized, they all decided to go for a refreshing swim in the lake to cool off. As evening approached, they got a campfire going, sat around making dinner, talking and laughing about their upcoming year of school. Everything was totally normal, just a typical camping trip with friends. Around 10 p.m., they were all still gathered around the fire when suddenly this bright object flashed across the sky. It was this brilliant blue color, and it literally lit up the entire sky for a couple of seconds as it streaked overhead. The group started discussing what they thought it might have been. I mean, most figured it was probably just an unusually large meteor. They talked about it for a few minutes, but then moved on to other topics as the night went on. As midnight approached, people started heading off to their tents. The main witness turned to his girlfriend and whispered about going back to their tent for some private time. But before he could even finish his sentence, his eyes caught something strange coming over the trees on the opposite side of the lake. He quickly stood up, called out to his brother to come look, but his brother responded that he was busy and to go away. And so he called out again, more urgently this time, but got the same annoyed response. And so finally, he yelled that this was really important and his brother needed to see this right now. But by this point, his best friend and girlfriend had joined him looking across the lake, and eventually his irritated brother came over too. And as soon as he saw what everyone was staring at, he's just like, what is that? Hovering very close to the water's surface was this strange object moving slowly back and forth. The glow from it was lighting up the surrounding area and the water underneath. And what really got their attention was that this thing was completely silent. There wasn't a single sound coming from it. And so his brother was looking through these binoculars, saying that this object had absolutely no distinguishing features on it at all. The group just stood there watching this as it moved silently, and then suddenly, just like someone had flipped off a light switch, it just vanished. Everyone was frozen, staring at the spot where it had just been. The only thing left was this faintly glowing circle on the water's surface, right where the object had been hovering. And then, after less than a minute, even that circle faded away completely, like nothing had ever been there. Now, about 2 hours later, after all the excitement had died down, everyone had finally gone to bed. The main witness was lying in his tent trying to get comfortable when he noticed that someone had left one of the battery-powered lanterns on outside. He was thinking about getting up to turn it off to save the battery when he saw the shadow of someone walk past his tent, and then another shadow passed by, and then another, and finally a fourth one. And at this point, he completely froze. He didn't move a single muscle as he strained his neck trying to get a better view of these shadows. Now at first, he thought maybe it was someone from their group walking around, but that thought disappeared pretty quickly when he realized each of these figures was only about 3 or 4 feet tall and extremely skinny. And the way their arms hung down was just wrong. Their arms were disproportionately long, hanging down almost to their knees. They seemed to be looking around the campsite, and he could hear them shuffling back and forth between the tents. And then one of them ran its hand over the fabric of his tent, and he just laid there absolutely terrified, praying they wouldn't try to look inside. Luckily, that was as close as they came. Within about 15 minutes of first appearing, these beings left the same way they had come, in a single file line, one right after the other. About 10 minutes after they vanished, he heard the first crack of thunder. and within minutes, they were in the middle of a torrential thunderstorm. The following morning, his brother woke him up saying he thought some raccoons had gotten to their campsite overnight and moved some stuff around. When he told the rest of the group about what he had seen, they all claimed he must have dreamt it all. And the way these things had moved through the camp, their bizarre proportions, how they had touched his tent, it had all been too real. And so there were now all these items around the campsite that had been moved or disturbed overnight, but his brother and the others were totally convinced it was just raccoons that had come through and messed their stuff up. And despite him trying to explain that what he saw was definitely not raccoons, nobody would believe him. I guess that's just another state to not go camping in. In the summer of 2008, two young men named Michael and Cody were out doing their normal survey work for the Trinity National Forest in California. They're basically spending their days collecting water samples from different creeks and springs throughout the forest. And normally, this was a pretty straightforward job. These two guys had been working together as surveyors for TNF for about 3 years. And this particular area was actually part of their regular rotation. And so they're driving down this really rough dirt road in their work truck, and it's the kind where you're basically bouncing around the whole time because there's just so many potholes and roots. Now they finally get to this spot where they can't drive any further, and now they've got to grab all their equipment, and we're talking about their collection vials, their testing kits, their GPS units, all that stuff, and hike the rest of the way on foot. And so they're out there for most of the afternoon, and everything's totally normal. They're checking off their list, getting samples from all these different water sources, making their coordinates, doing what they do. And the temperature's probably in the mid-70s. It's a clear day. It's a slight breeze, just perfect for field work. It's getting to be around 3:30 in the afternoon, and they're thinking, okay, we just need to get a few samples, that's all we have left, and then we can head back and be done for the day. Remember, these guys had done the exact same route probably a dozen times before. Now, this rock formation they needed to climb over, it wasn't necessarily challenging, maybe about 8 or 9 feet, just enough that you needed to use your hands to kind of scramble up it. The lead surveyor, he's carrying most of the testing equipment in his backpack, and his partner's got the GPS unit and the collection containers. The lead surveyor gets to the top first, and then something really strange happens. He just stops dead in his tracks. His partner, who's right behind him, actually runs straight into him and is like, "Hey, why'd you stop?" His partner drops one of the collection containers when he runs into him, and it goes rolling back down the rock. But even he's not thinking about that anymore because he can see his friend's face, and this guy who he's worked with for 3 years, who he's never seen rattled by anything, not bears, not mountain lions, nothing, is standing there with this look of absolute terror on his face. But the lead guy, he can't even speak. He's just standing there, his arms kind of waving around, totally unable to say anything. And so his partner's getting frustrated and just pushes past him to see what the problem is. What they saw next would completely change both of their lives. When the second guy looks down towards the creek, what he sees makes absolutely no sense. There's this large, smoky gray colored humanoid, and it's actually standing in the creek stabbing at fish with some kind of sharp stick. Now at this point, both men are frozen, totally unable to process what they're looking at, and whatever this is must have sensed them staring at it because it suddenly looked up at them, and when it did, they could see this absolutely terrified expression on its face. This thing is probably around 7 feet tall, and its arms are so long that when it bends over to fish, they nearly touch the water even from its full standing height. And these guys are trained observers. Their entire job is about documenting and recording precise details about the environment. There's no protocol for this. There's no box to check on their data sheets for massive humanoid creature fishing in the creek. When this thing looked up at them, they said its face had these really human-like features but distorted somehow. And then this thing does something really bizarre. It leaps up onto this massive boulder, and it's still staring directly at them. It raises these huge hands attached to these incredibly powerful arms, and it slaps the boulder so hard it makes this loud smacking sound and propels itself into the air onto another rock, still keeping its eyes locked on these two men, and then another slap, a third boulder, and with one final smack, it disappears into the tree line. Now, these two surveyors, who had been totally frozen in place, they just take off running back through the forest, and they're not even taking the trail they came in on. They're just crashing through the underbrush, jumping over fallen trees, basically taking the most direct route back to their truck possible. Now, they said later that they could still hear these weird echoing sounds behind them, but neither of them dared to look back. When they finally got to their truck, they were so shaken up that it took several attempts just to get the key in the ignition. And when they got back to the office, they didn't even file a report. They just turned in their samples from earlier that day and went home. The lead surveyor called in sick the next day, and when he came back, he put in for a transfer to a different district. These men who had been doing this job for years flat out refused to ever go back to that location again. And one of them, to this day, absolutely refuses to even talk about what happened. Both of these men were Native American who had grown up in the area and knew just about every animal that lived in these forests, who had spent their entire lives hearing the traditional stories about these things. Unfortunately, the identity of whatever it is they saw that day will remain a mystery. And speaking of mysteries, if you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below, camping, I'm staying inside. So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.